Hermits, if they occur to the modern mind at all, do so, presumably in the guise of mild old monks, living, no one quite knows how, in mossy caves, equipped with a knowledge of simples and the stars. A dog, an hourglass, an enormous hat, lend sometimes a touch of quaint and blameless humor to the romantic scene, such as the picture which Chateaubriand or Wordsworth paints. Far nearer to the truth are those still conventional prints of the 17th or of the 18th century, showing a fiercer generation, oak men, gnarled and knotted, hard as the desert stones they live among, clothed only in skins or cactus coats. And the fantastic note is there. You see them chained and loaded with huge weights peeping from tombs hanging in tubs perched, like storks, on slender pillars above all, haunted by goblins of the most attractive sort. I would like to ask what this strange race of men once stood for, appearing, scores of thousands strong, in the middle of our 4th Christian century, swarming by Nile and by Euphrates, populating the caverns of Palestine and Syria, and at last invading Europe. Why did they appear? Into what did they vanish or develop? Were they, so to speak, but a passing paroxysm of the human spirit? Or are we today in any sense their heirs? And is the world different now, for worse or better, because they long ago were in it? N.D. Moses said unto Joshua, "Fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand." And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And it came to pass, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands were heavy, and Aaron and Hur stayed up his hands, the one on the one side and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua discomfited Amalek. Exod. XVI 9-13. Christ said, "Pray without ceasing." And the history of Christians shows that, whatever else they did, they have always prayed. An unpraying church has never been seen or known. But there have always been men and women who have made explicit prayer a marked and special part of their life, and have deliberately tried to remove what hampered it. In the earliest days of Christianity, such people did not separate themselves, however, from their homes. A bright air of happy holiness breathed through the 1st century. Holiness was at least understood, even when not practiced. The early church was in no sense all saints, but no one was astonished at the triumphs of the Spirit. Worship was easy, but as Christianity spread and absorbed the masses, the level of holiness naturally sank. There were mixed marriages. Brothers might be pagan, whose sisters were Catholics. There were Christians in high government or municipal positions, skilled in compromise and reticence, obliged to consider the feelings of others and their own careers. There were enough to say they must not be behind the fashion of the times. There were those proud to take the lead in worldliness. Christians fought, at times, for their own great offices, and the pagan Pars Textatus used jestingly to say he would at once become a Christian if saint. Jerome would promise him he should be made pope, when, upon this gathering impetus to worldliness, a persecution like that of Decius, about 250, scattered the Egyptian Christians into the deserts. There were not a few who found this enforced emancipation from society grow so sweet that they prolonged their exile, or at least loved to live outside great towns, not in them apart too, from their families, when these once more were swept away in the bad old current. These men and women formed, however, no organized groups, and their exodus cannot be called a movement, nor a general force, acting on their period or the future. This was when St. Anthony was born. He was an Egyptian, and at 18 or 20 inherited his parents' not inconsiderable wealth. As for St. Francis in a later age, Christ's words, "Go, sell all that thou possessest," struck home to him. He made over his 300 acres of lucrative Egyptian soil to the poor of his own village, and again, thrilled by the injunction to take no heed for the morrow, gave away his monies and retired to the outlying territory, where he might meet with like-minded men and study eternal things. So it was neither flight from cruel tyrants nor seductive world, precisely, which first drove him to the wilderness, but sentences from those scriptures with which all these men were saturated. The impressionable boy, knowing his temperament to be all of moods, attached himself as disciple to an experienced old man, and thus weathered the reactions of melancholy and discouragement, and the feverish ambitions and the rebellions proper to his age. For 15 years he lived a life of study and austerity among the great Egyptian tombs, achieving, too, that intimate knowledge of the human soul, given to those only whose own soul has revealed its infinite capacities of good and ill, and has in all alike been governed. At last he felt even this discipline insufficient. He found a dismantled fort on the banks of the Nile, destined to become the monastery of Pispor de Dar el Mamun. And though the ruins were horrible with serpents, he remained unharmed, blocking his door, and receiving every 6 months a load of bread, which, with a few dates, was his food during some 20 years, a fact well vouched for and not hard to parallel. At the end of this time, his friends, who periodically visited him, still found him hale and hearty. He had, however, become a magnet for the solitaries, who trooped from near and far to consult him, and formed, at last, a colony around him. He finally left his seclusion and organized, to some extent, these crowds, and even, when persecution broke out afresh, went with several friends to help the Alexandrian Christians, visiting their prisons in the Sudan mines where they were kept at labor. Defying the pagan authority with much aplomb, yet, such was the chaotic administration of that distracted province, he was never himself arrested. Perhaps his reputation already made it not worth the risk. After 5 or 6 years of relatively external and active life, he ascended the Nile in search of greater solitude and crossed the desert to a mountain ridge confronting the Red Sea. Here his monastery, de Mar Antonios, is still surviving. He established himself upon this mountain and softened, it would seem, his austerity somewhat, since he cultivated enough ground near his cell to supply him with his minimum of food. Moreover, his external activity was considerable and regular. Not only the monks pilgrimaged to him, carrying water for the way on camels, but he descended periodically to visit and preserve in due order the monks of the lower desert, who had assembled there in thousands. But the links which bound them to one another were of the loosest. There were no specific vows, and individual tendencies had the free scope. It is true that in the inner Nitrian desert, called the cells, where this type of monachism is seen in its perfection, the type of life was purely eremitical. Outside they lived by 2s, 3s, or even more. On Sundays they met for common worship in an enormous church. In the enclosure round this church were 3 palm trees, and on each hung a whip. The first was to chastise monks who sinned through wantonness, the second for brigands who might fall upon the place, the third for strangers who flocked there and transgressed in any way whatsoever. The strangers, however, continued to flock and had a hostelry of their own, where they could stay as long as they liked, only. On weekdays they had to work in bakery or refectory, or at weaving flax. In the evening they had to go to the prayers and psalms, which went up so loud that a man might imagine his soul being exalted, that he was in the paradise of Eden. Anthony's influence radiated far, however, beyond the monastery of Pispor and even beyond Egypt. At Tbilisi, near Dendera Saint, Pachomius inaugurated in 318 a new style of monachism, highly centralized, with superior general, visitations, chapters, and the like, and with organized work, as an integral part of its system: gardening, carpentry, ironwork, basket-making, dyeing, tanning, cobbling, calligraphy, and the like. He had each its special department and staff. He set a moderately high level of life, obligatory upon all, but which each might surpass if he so felt able. Thus dinner was served at midday for those who could fast no more, and then set reward, hour by hour, for those who could hold out longer. This fully coenobetic life has less in common with St. Anthony's semi-eremitic system than, say, the Carthusian has, though it flowed from it, and became much more normal and was perfected in the Middle Ages. Meanwhile, St. Hilarion, who had visited Anthony about 310, inaugurated monachism in Palestine and Maraguen in 325, in Mesopotamia and Syria. This was where, owing to local tradition and instinct, the more fantastic forms of asceticism developed, such as violent bodily penances, rarely read of in Antonian literature, chained saints, tub saints, pillar saints, saints who never sat down, or never turned to this point, or that of the compass. Saint Simeon of the Pillar, a northern Syrian, is no myth. He first established himself on a sort of masonry platform, some 6 or 9 feet high, and ascended successively higher pillars, till he finally spent 30 years, exposed to all weathers, on a building 50 or 60 feet high, to which access was had only by ladders. The top was fenced round, and 2 of his disciples found room there when he was dying. It is doubtful whether he was visible outside the walls of his enclosure. He found, perhaps, inspiration from the use to which the Asiatic pillar tombs were put, squat buildings 10 or 20 feet in height, with the tomb at the top, say 6 feet by 4. The Harpy tomb in the British Museum is such a tomb, and has probably been inhabited by a Christian hermit. However, Syria had seen pillar ascetics even in pagan times, and Lucian describes, in his treatise on the Syrian goddess, those tall columns on which her priest would stand, sleepless, for 7 days, surrounded by devotees. They sent up to them by another priest, who climbed them as men climb palm trees, offerings and requests for oracles. It remains that Saint Simeon's reputation and influence were enormous. He, like Saint Anthony, lived in touch with emperors, and was consulted by politicians, judges, and generals, and actively combated the philosophical heresies of his day. Both were men of shrewd judgment, and from the tops of pillars and mountains gained a fairly comprehensive view. Saint Anthony died after 45 years upon his Red Sea ridge, aged 105, his sight and hearing unimpaired, and all his teeth sound in his head. Saint Athanasius, who loved him, and perhaps felt himself something of a Joshua beside this Moses, wrote his life, an event of very far-reaching consequences. For the moment, I would say that Anthony is a perfectly alive and strongly featured personality. It used to be the fashion to declare that no one really wrote the books everyone supposed they had, and a learned fad even to deny that persons of supreme importance had really lived. Scholars have pleasantly surmised not only that Athanasius never wrote the life of Anthony, but that whoever did invented him tout Dio in peace, and that the great man was, as completely as King Arthur, Buddha, or Abraham, not to mention other more sacred names, a mere hero of romance. A witty bishop proved, quite as conclusively, that Napoleon was a solar myth, and Dom E.C. Butler, OSB, has done more than any one man else to restore credit to the whole Antonian literature, and no one should do more, now, than draw amusement from these critics. We feel in touch with Anthony, we visualize him more easily than his contemporary emperors, or than many a medieval king or all but modern statesman. Had I to circumscribe, in a word, that characteristic of Anthony which seems the most impressive, I should say dignity. Dignity is theirs who are strong and gentle. It fails in the sturdy hustler and the bully, the muscular lazy lout, or professional strongman in, those tornado folk who carry all before them, and do a day's business so as to leave a 6 weeks task of clearing up to their subordinates. It fails, too, in the merely sympathetic, the cozener or cajoler, the delightful creatures, who expect to get their way because you are, to succumb to them. It fails again in the prim, the pattern of propriety, the correct person whose position in the world is certainly assured, because he has behind and around him the enormous mass of the expected of, comfortable custom, who does not shock nor challenge. Pomposity may be there, a smug sufficiency, but not dignity. You may have found a personage, but in none of these cases true personality. It was by force of personality, you feel, that Anthony was conqueror, which caused him instantly to be singled out, unknown before, among the flocking monks which enthralled thousands, not into admiration only, nor homage, but positive, chosen, difficult thought and action, which caused his portrait to be everywhere in Rome, he yet alive and altered lives throughout an empire of different races and instincts, and throughout centuries still unfinished. And this man fled publicity, and yet sought no mystic halo, lurked within no cocoon of myth, denied himself complete invisibility. Like the unseen Persian kings, almighty in his solitude, Anthony, when he did appear, mixed with his monks in absolute simplicity. He gave himself no airs of dignity, which requires a prop is no dignity at all. A teacher who fears to recognize he was mistaken, a professor who pretends rather than acknowledge ignorance, a demonstrator who fakes. Experiments sooner than risk an unsuccess, these are the weaklings, unsure men, undignified in the process of their fraud, and heading for the supreme humiliation of being found out. For men's eyes are sharp, and those not least of the uninstructed, the simple folk, the layman. Someone is bound to cry out that the emperor has no clothes on, and the world laughs, and the great pretense collapses. Anthony then was strong and had the simplicity of his strength. He has nothing to fear from his generation or our own. With this, as I said, went gentleness, not softness. Giants are often soft, and many a stalwart lad has nothing of a constitution. True gentleness has to go with complete manliness, and you may play, if you like, with the word gentleman. The monks, in their chronicles, are habitually called athletes, and their doings described in terms taken from the wrestling ring. Yet, just as Anthony's gravity was not morose, nor his austerity gloom, so his robust training was never brutal, nonchalant, or clumsy. There is, indeed, a tolerance better, a tenderness in the anecdotes which cluster round him, a delicate understanding of human nature, which prove that his heart was great, not only to endure, but to embrace his virility, not rigidity. his otherworldly ardor not incompatible with an adaptable method well in place in any man of affairs, a graciousness, intolerable in the second-rate or snob, but to be looked for in a right splendid gentleman. As we still can say, who has no need, has no taste, to condescend, but respects those from whom he rightly claims respect, and a loyal affection, in fact, a warmth of love justly to be sought in one who names himself Christ's follower. There is a lovable story, restored to notice by Dom Cuthbert Butler, in which all these characteristics are hinted at, together with a crisp touch of humor, which, quite unexpectedly, perhaps, goes crackling through that better than the Arabian Nights Thalassiac history by Palladius. Eulogios, struck by a passion for immortality, deserted the world's hubbub. But he grew lonely, and seeing a man crippled of hand and foot, though glib enough of tongue, made pact with God that he would take and tend the beggar till he died, and through him be saved. The cripple throve for 15 years, and then fell sick. Eulogios bathed, fed, and cured him. With convalescence came temper. The cripple railed at his benefactor, adding to a string of insults. And for climax, you want to get yourself saved by means of me. Put me in the marketplace. I want meat. Eulogios gave him meat. No, put me in the marketplace. I want the crowds. Oh, put me where you found me. Eulogios grew serious. Am I to cast him forth? But God and I have given our right hands, or keep him. But to me he gives bad days and nights. He consults his friends. Both of you go to Anthony. Now Anthony, when men called on him, had them announced as from Egypt or Jerusalem, according as their quest was frivolous or sincere, and treated the former courteously but briefly, and the latter with long care. Which said he, as the pair approached, are these? A mixture, said Macarius, his secretary. Eulogios entered first. To him, Anthony said, in grave and austere voice, thou wouldst cast him forth. But he who made him casts him not forth at all. Thou wouldst cast him forth. But God hath raised up the fairer one than thou to gather him. Then to the other, O crooked soul and crippled, cease thy fight with God. Knewest thou not it was Christ who served thee? To Christ thou speakest thus? For Christ's sake Eulogios has made himself thy slave. He bade them affectionate farewell, and the two went home friends, and died within 3 days of one another. Altogether, St. Anthony recalls the colossal figures of the patriarchs, the grave beauty of an Abraham, father of God's folk Moses, holding up hands of prayer above the battling Israel, eagle-eyed prophets and psalmists strong to praise, proclaim, and worship. And all alike are utterly in tone with that grand east of theirs, fierce at its hours, grim with sand and rock in the ruthless noontime, yet flaming or melting into unimagined loveliness of color in the quick rising and setting of the day. There are moments of the dawn when no daffodil nor primrose is more splendid or more delicate than are those mountains, and their shadowed chasms are as subtle as the violet, and the sky more pure than any speedwell's blue. And again, no carnation and no cornflower can glow more gorgeous than those same ridges and that sky, and at another moment, the whole world grows translucent, like the ruby, the amethyst, or oriental sapphire, or John's apocalyptic gold. So rich a grandeur is to be observed, by no mere fanciful enthusiasm, in these great men of South and East. So superb a figure, so firm, yet so various and so lovable, shows St. Anthony upon his Red Sea mountain. Note are we to look to this affinity with the Old Testament for a partial explanation of the love these early monks displayed for the concrete, the materialistic example, and the acted parable. Jeremiah, Isaiah, even Ezekiel recur at once to mind. Monks come to ask St. Anthony whether they must welcome pilgrims or rebuff them. Anthony retires, reappears in rags, sits down, and says no word. He again retires, comes back in feast day gear, and sits silent. The third time he withdraws, and returns in his wonted dress. Look, am I different because my clothes are? Even so, come one, come all, come none, be equable within yourselves, kind to all, at peace in a crowd, at peace alone. By their real selves they must live. Thoughts, temptations, instantly visualize themselves. He journeys through a desert, he thinks of wealth. Forthwith a silver bowl appears by the roadside. He recognizes a temptation, and the bowl vanishes. In fine, he sees to right and left the demons who are tempting him, herein passing beyond the Gospel's hint, which says, Satan hath bound her, we are legion, but does not show the spirits. Allowing for the sheer element of romance, these stories from the desert are full of sound psychology and moral value. Nathaniel swears never to leave his cell. The devil jeers at him. and off Nathaniel goes. After this, the devil, dressed like a Roman huntsman, slings stones round the runaway's new cell. Nathaniel, annoyed, extracts the confession that this is he who cajoled him out of his old cell and will get him out of this one too. Rather cleverly, he does indeed leave the new cell, only, however, to return to the old. The devil changes tactics and will make vice of virtue. Certain bishops visited. 44. Nathaniel now, they were all holy men, and on their departure the monk, grown obstinate, refused to escort them even for one step. Dost thou possess the faculty of 44 pride? Grumbled their servants, that thou 44 wilt not accompany the bishops? I died 44 once for all to my lords the bishops and to all the world. I have a secret, and he remained indoors. The devil, not satisfied, took the shape of a young man and knocked. My ass has fallen. Come out to help me, lest the hyenas slay us. Now there were 44 many hyenas in the place. Nathaniel could not be sure if this were God's voice, or a sign that his will had reached its limit. He prayed and cried, if thou needest help, God will 44 send it if thou art a temptation. Be thy fraud discovered here, and charity mated with determination. The devil was shamed, and took the shape of a whirlwind in the form of wild asses which dance about and skip. This is the triumph of blessed Nathaniel, and this his labor and his ending. Sometimes the very romances are delightful, as when the holy man Macarius went to find the magic garden of the desert and fixed, at every mile, a reed in the ground, signposts for return. And the devil pulled them all up, and when Macarius was 1 mile from his destination, he found them, on awaking, all in a bundle under his head. This was to teach him to trust the God of the pillars of fire and smoke. Incidentally, when he did reach the garden, through a cloud of devils who came out in the shape of ravens, there was nothing there but a dried well with rusted bucket, and a few pomegranates shriveled by the sun. The author I have quoted, a man of remarkable intuition and much freedom from mere formula, writes of Ruysbrock what well may be said of the early monastic life in the Mass. Unfortunately, one's vulgar sense is always flicked, earliest by the startling and exaggerated, and it is difficult not to see, first of all, in this curious page of history, precisely what is least substantial in it, namely, the pillars, the tubs, the tricks of demons, the abnormalities. In short, even when we try hard to replace the torn-out page in its proper position at the head of the 4th or 5th chapter of a volume well in the middle of a series, it is not, alas, the immediate context which first comes to our help, that we may understand it. We think with difficulty through the brains of those 3rd century Egyptians, Catholic, heretic, or pagan. We have deliberately to recall the pre-Christian asceticism of that country, the priesthoods of the Nile land, the mystics of Alexandria, and Neoplatonism. We have to look up books to make sure of what the fanatics of Asia were about, and to revive our memories of the pillar priests of Syria. The easier thing is, I suppose, to allow the grotesque figures of Indian fakirs to engage one's memory, though even these owe most of their familiarity to England's chance association with the Indian East. And next, I cannot but recall, in the Greek world, the school of Cynic philosophers, with whom, as a matter of fact, contemporaries themselves were anxious that the Christian ascetics should not be identified. In the Far East, then China and India, a respectable monastic system existed and exists, worthy of much sympathetic attention, but despite the dreams of, say, theosophists, and despite a certain tendency among the late Greeks to travel and to idealize the life of the Brahmins, it did not influence in any substantial way our Western monasticism, nor does it readily appeal to the Western mind. The degenerate vagabond race of fakirs, for this Mohammedan word has come to be popularly applied to Hindu devotees, almost exclusively has struck our imagination, strange and hateful aberrations of the ascetic instinct, men who would burn and wound themselves without feeling pain, or stand with arms upraised till muscles grew inflexible, or with hands clenched till nails pierced through the palms and projected through the flesh. Hindu religion has always lent to madness, cruelty, panic, and obscenity run riot in the brains it has corrupted, but not these. Again, came into contact with the Christian monks, and comparisons drawn between them could only be based upon the supposition of a similar perverted instinct, common to humanity, in each of the two groups. Of all Greek figures, I dare say the still most popular is Diogenes, who lived in a tub and cheeked the almighty Alexander, and went about with a lantern in broad daylight, looking for a real man. Lie came second, however, in that school of cynics, which persevered for centuries and got its repute chiefly for its total contempt of all conventions, extending from public insolence to emperors to sermons in the slums, and from an extreme asceticism of the will, at the expense in theory at least, and often in practice of the senses, and to the most slack and filthy habits of dress and behavior. They penetrated everywhere. They shouted their insults in the circus. They railed against adoring ladies in the most fashionable drawing rooms. They tutored the rich and consorted with the poor, who often loved them. They were famous for denying en bloc all popular beliefs, empire, wealth, love, law, science, and in short, the validity of civilization itself. Austere philosophers were among them, who have left their mark on the history of asceticism and a multitude of disgusting charlatans. Whose tricks enliven the pages of ancient literature and are cursed by a juvenile and gaily sneered at by a Lucian. This singular race of men was fathered by Antisthenes, a disciple as who was not. For an antagonist is his disciple without whom he never would exist of Socrates. He seized on the Socratic will to think and applied ruthless reason to every existing human institution. This deeply embittered man deliberately attacked civilization as a corruption, and going far behind the mild and noble savage of a Rousseau, beheld in animals the authoritative model for our race, and even wrote a book on them. Not Swift himself dared this. With the development of family, still more of city life, all fraud he held, all injustice and hatred, entered the world. Zeus was right in punishing Prometheus, who gave to men that fire which was the seed of arts and crafts. Well-being has bred effeminacy. Unprotected man is the strongest. Frogs are as delicate of structure as are humans, and need no coats nor any armor. Nature is reasonable. Leave her to workman's choice. As arbitrary as inventions are disastrous. We believe them to be good, and move in a world of illusion. Empire means misery. The beggar's life alone is free. Only the pauper is world citizen, but a beggar's life is surely wretched. Yes, he answers, if you believe in pleasure, better madness than pleasure. If I met Aphrodite, I would kill her. By the vile lens of his symbolic life, his fierce parables and action, Diogenes drove home these beliefs. He shrank from no paradox. Cannibalism? Well, why not eat human flesh? It feeds incest. Well, what does marriage exist for? Yet through the history of these hypocrites or madmen, as you may please, runs a live wire of ideal ministry to the sorrow of the world. Mankind is one. Mankind suffers, and it accepts and doubles its own suffering by believing in the illusions which alone enforce it. What vitiated this was their total aloofness from all concrete history for a faith, the palace deism, surviving from their ruin of popular religious systems. And an appalling spiritual pride inevitable when a man differentiates himself from his fellow men without an active belief in a transcendent God before whom all men are equal in created littleness, though called to an essential equality and dignity as his sons. And the adoption of a system of exterior life which lent itself more easily to the cultivation of a spirit of show and ostentation than of what it professed to symbolize. Almost anyone can, if it flatters him enough, qualify as an ascetic acrobat. It will be seen, first, from this contrast, what the monks were not. They were not, on the one hand, men who so believed in the illusions of the senses that, like those whom the fakirs travesty, they seek, by negation of all will, to escape from the cycle of finite existence and so to emerge and lose their personality in the undifferentiated absolute. They believed in God and their eternal selves, and their life was a long effort to make themselves what he would have them eternally to be. Nor yet were they cynics, whose will triumph was based wholly on the self-sufficiency intrinsically possible to individual man. Their strength, they held, flowed primarily from God through Christ their Lord. He made their will strong for and through himself. India ruined the notion of humanity, body and soul. Greece exalted it to replace the Godhead. The monks believed in man's created littleness and possible high dignity, and wrestled, God helping them, to transcend the one and win the other. The two contrasts just made were worth making, especially the second, but they look backwards. And it has just occurred to me that Charles Kingsley drew a picture of the second generation of monks which still, I suppose, may cloud the imagination of some. He shows them as fanatical to murder point, and no doubt, by picking out this case or that, multiplying it, and making it representative, he can create an argument. It remains that his general picture is false, and that he shows himself here, as in Westward Ho. To use Monsignor Benson's words, incapable of seeing the truths for which he had not a temperamental sympathy. Now, let us directly consider the quality of the first great movement of Christian monasticism. Let us own at once that it contained a sufficiency of downright fanatics, perhaps dishonest. These gadabouts trading on sensation lovers among the ignorant crowd, or the jaded aristocracy brawling in the marketplace. Bursting into palaces, filthy of dress, fantastic in penances, excited the rage, not alone of the cultured enemies of all enthusiasm, but of ardently ascetic spirits like Saint Jerome, who both by example and writing testified to his supreme admiration for the pure monastic ideal. These men, out for money and careless of popular contempt, or even of the physical discomforts they might choose merely through coarseness of soul fiber, may be disregarded. They were made possible by the monks, but were never truly of them. These few are the fakirs of Christianity. Again, there are the stupid. Men often see only the externals of a life and fail utterly to grasp its inner spirit. To a greater or less degree, monks of this limited mentality mimicked the practices of those great men round whom they grouped themselves and tried to excel what they saw done. And even to invent, forgive me if I use the word now necessary to our language, their special stunt, it was in the control and educating of these limited minds and headstrong impulses that the monastic ideal of obedience became so healthfully operative. More dangerous by far was the infection of genuine fanaticism. Blood intoxicates always, whether it be another's or one's own. The Eastern degenerates I have alluded to certainly went mad of their self-inflicted wounds. Apart from blood, pain too can come to fascinate. The frantic insomnia of the Syrian priests, hot-eyed and with bursting temples as they stood upon their pillars, could feed upon itself and become almost a habit and sleep in agony. In this very horrible department of human perversion, some of the baser crowd of Christian ascetics, even, will surely find their place. But whatever the nature of the method they adopted, or the greater or less intelligence with which they lived it out, these men had for very simple premises belief in God, in immortality, and in sin. They fled from a wicked world lest they should lose their soul. And in order, though this was a secondary motive to convert the world they had left, they worked at the very grammar of the spiritual life, and without guessing it, often achieved a most subtle knowledge of its minutiae. They began like men anxious to grasp, and then to instill, the necessary rudiments of a dead language. In some cases they became like schoolmasters, passionate over rules, and maddened by the sight of howlers in their pupils' work. At times the whole spirit of learning seems to evaporate beneath the touch of these honest, limited pedagogues. They succeed in writing and obtaining correct exercises and no more. They have nothing of the sense which thrives best, say, in some ancient home of culture, like Oxford, and which fastens on imagination, or spirit, or originality, or instinct for that thought which is behind and fashions language, and compensates for mere mistakes. Anyone can make mistakes. Probably Cicero and Demosthenes did themselves, certainly Virgil did, certainly Catullus. But the life was in them. In much that these old monks said and did is to be found an almost terribly strong faith in a few vast things, and an all-day and all-night grind at applying their principles to the stuff their souls provided. If in the doing it their eyes grew dross of lead, they cared little enough for that. If they were dead from the waist down and paralyzed for half the occupations of human life, well, they never would have pretended that their life was a full human life, but rather a rehearsal of death. Better than was Plato's, for after all, life was short and eternity was long. Do what you will. In an unsophisticated brain, the thoughts of sin, salvation, the soul, eternity, once they take fire, burn up most other thoughts, and these overwhelming considerations draw to themselves all the vitality which else were deflected into 100 channels. Fanaticism. A word easy to repeat, and a word difficult to understand. Supposing these things are true, eternal loss or gain, is it not indeed enough to drive a man, to the world's estimation, mad when he sees the possible best in men corrupted and corruption comes, not alone through misuse, but disuse the most promising boys duped, drugged, and made nothing of. The most delightful girls vulgarized and left selfish and bored, ideals unborn, action unfed by any stuff for enterprise. Life annulled the empty occupations of the provinces and the petty round of middle-class society, the gay glamour of town. And the enormous fraud of all that makes that good time than which so many ask no more. The culture of universities, refined, unenthusiastic, radically sceptical, the shibboleths of science, the insolent offense of journalism, the tyranny of a season, or of business, and the obliterating mass of drudgery which makes pulp of the worker's existence. Until the explosion comes which creates only a worse chaos. To many it seems quite hopeless ever to come to anything in such environments. The only possible chance is to get out of them, convert them, remaining in and with them, in the world, not of it. And texts are easily enough quoted. but in practice that seems as naive as the young girl's dream who fancies herself called to convert the charming rake. And Iver, for of his vice she knows nothing save by hearsay, edited at that, and lured only by the help of romantic imagination, untaught to supply details. But they have been fully in the spell of lamp-lit laughter, which transfigures the crude reality of lust, and have felt conscience strangled out by wealth, and watched ideals break their fine wings against the enormous inertia of custom. So they hate it, so they leave it, so they practice its direct opposite, furiously, exaggeratedly, clamorously. They do not profess to be leading, exactly, Christ's own life. They are the Baptists who prepare Elis' way, and even to be that is an honor and a crown. Nor can we pretend they went unrewarded, even by the world they flouted. The immediately valuable element in this strange movement, which I would disengage valuable, for the individual monk, and it has been proved, for European civilization generally, is that it put order into mysticism. By mysticism, I mean that human tending to seek the superhuman, to identify in some sense the soul with the super-soul that is, in the long run, God, and by counter-effect, to disesteem the transient, limited, and visible, and in particular the body. The extreme of both tendencies is to be seen, as I said, in India. Nowhere else had been registered, in combination, so passionate a belief in the ultimate one, in Brahma, in that unnameable, all in which all forms are to merge, and so furious a rage with the limitations of flesh and sense. Of course there too, the perfect philosophers will disdain ascetic aberrations. And the base fakir is incapable of the lofty vision, but nowhere else is the intervening territory so wide or so densely populated with men in whose brains the idea you undoubtedly exists, grown conscious, fixed, and imperative. And in whose bodies the delicious agony of self-immolation has become so absorbing. In Syrian asceticism, nearer home, the idea was far less cogent. The physical frenzy existed, and was hideous enough, but, while it was more noticeable than the philosophy, it issued forth on a less wide scale and provided little enough art, if any. Art in some countries reveals, as among the Aztecs, such suggestions of insanity, which can quite well go with extreme cleverness of execution, and indeed with remarkable indications of scientific method and conception that we are all but justified in arguing, from its evidence alone, and to a similar loss of moral equilibrium. In Athens, the sense for physical beauty, of the supreme value of limit, made any such loss of equilibrium disgusting even to the less sensitive and educated in a Plato. Although in some ways his philosophy was simply, as they say, asking for it, it made it unthinkable. Though his symposium is perilous. Dare I say that in the Greeks was innate a quality really not unlike our English respectability, our sense of limit and behavior of good form rather than of form. Generally, or of the right working value of ideas, for, as a race, we do not take kindly to ideas. Yet one is always hearing ascetics or mystics condemned as exaggerated, and even a distinguished professor has condemned the fathers of the desert for practices which he described as climax of disparagement, as not respectable. Some of the Greeks, the cynics, that is certainly found their way out of that, and were disliked accordingly. The Egyptian Neoplatonists and their allies combined disparate cultures, the Greek, and their own immemorial tradition, and in no books belonging to the immediate background, or seed plot, of our own world will you find such amazing upsoaring of the spirit, and such sensual pruriency juxtaposed. In our present-day England, and also in America, though the national characteristic holds good, there seems to be quite a remarkable recrudescence of ideas, or desire, at any rate, to cope with what lies behind and beyond the usual schemes of practical life. Hence the torrent of mystical literature in which speculation seethes and bubbles, each new formula exploding in quick succession. The fire is there, and the liquid mind stuff is there. It remains a question of what gets precipitated, what made a scum of what, in fine, emerges from all this turmoil. We certainly can't cope with our ideas. We haven't a notion from what to start, how to regulate, whither to guide our effervescent mysticism. The results are as insipid and far less salutary than morning salts. Quite different was the birth of philosophy, for instance, in Ionia. Totally different the unparalleled intellectual ferment of the 13th century. Best comparable is the Gnostic period, when into the melting pot were chucked the products of Greece, Palestine, Persia, Syria, India, Egypt, and Rome. One of the very first things for which the movement inaugurated by Anthony and developed by Pachomius and by St. Basil in the East was responsible, was the imposing of order upon the mystical will, which issues at once into asceticism. For we may be allowed to regard this particular movement as concerned rather with the will than with intellect. And that is why it reminds us so directly of the cynics the great leaders had to cope, not alone with the extremists in enthusiasm, but with the opposite. Yet not more elementary problem of petty passions. We read of a nunnery where the nuns would slap their particular bête noire, empty water over her, and put mustard in her nostrils. A chaplain had to sit all the day at his window to see what they were up to. All alike, these great ones had to grind at grammar heavens. How one wishes, when one reads these books about souls in tune with the infinite secret gardens, curtain shrines and whatnot, that our generation could be set to grind at grammar. Which of us dares to say he is master even of simplest sentence building? Hence the enormous value of that substratum of sound sense, and that insistence on the supreme importance of obedience which is to be found in all monastic writings. The will was to be developed, but by control. It is these men with whom a St. Ignatius is in truest continuity. It has been well said that Cassian, whose conferences were written some 70 years after the life of Anthony, appeared, composed therein a sort of summa of the ascetic life, and it is this which is taken up and developed within the limits of his conventions by a Jesuit, Alfonso Rodriguez, novice master in Majorca. It is exasperating when modern critics enlarge upon the reckless enthusiasms or lopsided fanaticism of these men, or produce their weak reproofs, such as the monks created their temptations, introspection breeds hypersensitiveness, loneliness spoils perspective. Do they really suppose these masters of human psychology did not know all that? Never has it been so clearly stated. Let them but read Pachomius's advice to Palladius on purity. What adjective would they consider least applicable of all to Anthony? Probably our slang word clubbable, sociable. Shall we translate it? Yet that is precisely how Anthony was described: pleasant, never worried by dust of thought, untroubled by turbulent or peevish or melancholy mood, toxicitu. A true man of the world. Did the monks underestimate human nature? Why, so far did these ascetics of the East, and I include the great Cappadocian fathers, like Basil and the Gregories, and a John Chrysostom, proceed in their praise of human possibility that they seemed, to some, to lean too far in that direction. And the word semi-Pelagianism has been pronounced, if only to deny that they rightly incurred the reproach of insufficiently distinguishing natural perfectibility from the UN shared work of grace. Yes, for shrewd human knowledge, and for simple downright humor, the first ascetics deserve high place in our affection and esteem. I have tried to indicate, without even beginning to elaborate it, an organic and active element of perhaps primary importance for Christian history in the early monastic movement. Observe the line along which it inevitably operated. Anthony's life was written by Athanasius and caused a crisis in the process of St. Augustine's own conversion. Thus the whole current of Augustinianism, so different in many ways from Antonianism, yet so potent and so formative in European history, was, if not set going, yet accelerated by, and in a real measure due to, Anthony. This is far more important than, say, the fact that Constantine the Great and his sons corresponded with the famous solitary and were, to some degree, influenced by his counsel. Other elements in Western monarchism are directly due to its Eastern prototype. Not to dwell on the earlier systems of South Italy, the work of St. Martin in Gaul and the movement in Ireland itself were in direct imitation of the Egyptian monks. More important still, St. Benedict used, while he modified, the examples set by the fathers of the desert. He was a maker, as much as any great man can be, but none can work. Like the Creator, out of nothing he would never have done what he did without his materials, and these all came from Anthony and his successors. Now, when the Roman Empire went down in ruins, 3 permanent centers of cohesion remained, 3 channels through which the old civilization, its law, culture, and idealism flowed: the Pope, the bishops, and the monasteries. Without these, what would have been formed out of the chaotic elements of barbarism, and when? Not, anyhow, the Europe of today. Not Paris, not Oxford. Not Aquinas, Dante, Shakespeare, not anything, you may say, save our northern emotions and their dangers, which enters into us today. Granted that this, as it stands, is exaggeration. Yet within it is truth enough for it to express something of what the world directly owes to Anthony.